Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, or welcome to the channel if you're new here. I'm Chris from the Ultimate Recycler, and on this channel we do a lot of different things, from repairing stuff to unboxing antiques to valuations to going treasure hunting. I'm also an avid bottle collector, and recently we've been unboxing and discovering a few antique bottles. So there's been many requests, and now it's time to do a comprehensive video on how to clean antique bottles. I had a quick look on YouTube, and there's lots of videos about this on the US site. I didn't see any other Aussie ones. Not that glass is any different anywhere in the world, but we might have some tips that you haven't seen before. Now, every bottle collector who digs and finds antique bottles will well know that they're found dirty. You really just don't dig them up in clean condition. It depends on the soil type. Sometimes in volcanic soil, I've dug bottles that are almost mint and just need a rinse under the water. I don't have any dirty ones here, like freshly dug bottles. Quite often they're full of dirt, and sometimes the soil conditions will actually affect the glass, and we'll talk about that as we go through this video. Now, the first thing to do if you've dug out a bottle out of the ground and it's full of dirt is to remove the dirt out of it carefully. So I sometimes use a piece of wire or something without trying to, push too hard, because you can mark the top. But get all the loose dirt out of it. If you've dug it in swampy or wet conditions, you're not going to get the mud out very easily, and go straight to step one of soaking them in normal everyday tap water. So before we move on into cleaning this one, let's just look at some of the tools you're going to have. And every bottle collector that digs bottles will arrange an armory of favourite weapons to use. Bottle brushes is the obvious one. They're going to handle basically just the dirt. You can come up with little bits of wire that you can bend into shape with a little bit of, I've got some steel wool here, and we'll talk about that shortly as well. Also, I've got a little bottle brush here, and it's really handy for getting into corners. So that's really just for moving the dirt. We will look at some other methods I use for when you have more stubborn stains, and those stains will include internal stains, and some of them you can't remove with normal methods. We'll talk about that. You can also find a haze on the front that just won't come off with normal washing in water. You can get, we got one here, you can get rust stains. I've only a couple on this bottle here, but some bottles, particularly if you've dug them in a tip with lots of wire and tin, they can have bad rust stains on them, and generally that won't come off with a quick clean. So we'll talk about that as well. There's other things. Sometimes bottles have a wrap around the cork. This is actually a tomato sauce, but sometimes, especially in the square case gin bottles, you'll get the remains of a lead wrap, and it's very hard to get that off with normal washing. The other problem you can have is contents that have been in the bottle that perhaps weren't original. This was a beer, but it looks like that's some sort of oil or something in there. So bottles were repurposed for all sorts of things, and some of that is hard to remove. So we'll talk about getting that out as well. But as I said, the first step is to get all the loose soil off for a start, or if you found it under a house or under a building or in a shed, and the Americans often refer to something being found in a barn, they can look like this. They can just be grubby from years of sitting around. I think this one had been under a house, and you can kind of see that there's a line of soil on the bottom there, and that would have been the way it was lying underneath a house for quite a long time. Now, this has some issues, but it doesn't affect the cleaning process. So the first thing I would do with this one is just wash it in normal tap water, not too hot, not too cold, and perhaps then we'll get a tub with some warm soapy water, and we'll talk about the next step. So once you've soaked your bottles for a few days, I like to do it for a few days. I usually put them in a bucket of water outside and just leave them. It softens all the soil, especially inside. And we're at the stage now, or the first stage of actual cleaning. Now with water, I've got warm soapy water here. It's not even very warm. It's more tepid. And you have to be very careful, especially with your older thick glass bottles, like there's a broken cod, for example. Very thick glass. When you change temperature quickly, you set up a lot of stresses in the glass because it warms and expands one side and not the other. And if there's any small fractures in the glass, guaranteed you'll get a crack start to run. So be very careful of sudden changes in temperature. Even going from a bucket of water outside to warm water, if you're in a cold climate and the water outside is very cold, let the bottle acclimatise before you put it into the warm water. So now that we've got past that, we can start the cleaning. I have a couple of longer bottle brushes here. This one has a fairly narrow top, which makes it easy to get in. I usually give it a bit of a twist, and it will just wipe the soil away very easily. You do have to be a little bit careful rubbing it against the neck, as I mentioned before. I think I did. Sometimes some people wrap some electrical plastic tape around the thing, just to stop the chance of getting marks on the glass. So one thing with using soapy water I find is really good is that you can froth it up, and it makes it really easy to see where the bad dirty parts are. And that one's actually on the outside. So now that we've got some outside marks, what do we do there? Well, I often use a scouring pad. It won't hurt the glass, and it will take most of the bad stuff off. If you have a part that won't move very well and it's quite tough, you can go up to steel wool. Now, glass is harder than steel, so a little bit of steel wool will not harm the glass, and it usually takes stubborn marks off quite easily. You can certainly also use this more of a scourer type. I wouldn't do it too much because eventually you will scuff the glass and you'll dull it. So if you've got a glossy bottle, there'll be a dull patch. So don't overuse the steel wool or the scourer, but it is great for getting some of the stubborn marks off. Just while we're talking about the steel wool, I do like to use the soapy steel pads on some things. I don't use them on bottles because it makes them unbelievably slippery, and they just slip out of your hands even if you're being really careful. Ask me how I know. So no soap on the scouring pads, but a little bit of soapy water, and you need to work in around the embossing a little bit, but that's the best way to clean just normal everyday type stains off the outside of the bottle, and likewise the bottle brush on the inside. And we can see with the aid of the bubbles in there, of the froth, we can see when we've got it clean, a bit more dirty spots here. I think it's mostly on the inside. And sometimes around the shoulder it's a little hard to get to. And that's when we can bring out the bent piece of wire, which we can adjust the angles. And if we can get that into the neck, it's easier to work around the shoulder a bit. You do have to be careful the end of the wire doesn't scratch the glass either. So we'll finish cleaning this one up, and then we'll talk about some of the more stubborn stains. Right, I've got that as clean as I can inside. I'll get the soap out, give it a bit of a swirl. I'm actually not sure if you swirl the opposite way if you're in the northern hemisphere. I'm not sure on that. Let me know. Okay, so we've got a bit of soapy residue in there, but that's cleaned up quite well. We can see some fractures to the glass. This bottle does have some dings in it, and it's still a bit dirty on the base. So we'll just use the scourer to get rid of that. And it's still a little dirty inside on the base. So what we can do with that, and how I also like to clean smaller bottles, is with some cut copper, because it's very hard to get bottle brushes into small bottles, and some of the necks you just physically won't fit it through. Even the smaller brushes may not reach the bottom. So when we have dirt on the bottom, or when we have a smaller bottle with a narrow neck, I like to use some cut copper. Now this is just copper wire that I've cut into little sort of 1 to 2 millimeter pieces, and it didn't take long to do this. I'll show you how I did it in a tick. You can actually buy copper from people that do bottle polishing, and we'll talk about that shortly as well. But the good thing with copper is it's very soft, it won't harm the glass, and it's got pretty good weight to it. Now some people will say you can use rice, and rice does work, but it goes soft after a while, but it doesn't have the weight to help get it into the corner of the bottles and dislodge the soil. Also, you can use gravel or very fine gravel, or like sand. But I'm a little bit hesitant to use that because the quartz can actually scratch the glass. But if you can't find some copper, it certainly does work okay. So to create my copper, I just got some heavy gauge copper wire that most scrappers would have some of this in their boxes. It's probably around about 1.5 mil diameter. I'm not sure what that is in actual gauge. It doesn't really matter what size, but this I find is a good size. And I'm using some tin snips, and if you have them in a row, what have we got, 5 strands there, you can cut the 5 strands pretty easily, and it doesn't take long to build up a handful, or a small handful, of little bits of cut copper. Now, you don't have to do this every time. The copper will keep. We will get it back out of the bottle, probably put it in a little jar and use it over and over and over again. It doesn't really wear out. So as far as this big bottle goes, I've just got a little bit of water in the bottom. We don't want too much. So we'll just pour the copper into the bottle via the funnel. We shouldn't need much, as this was just really a little bit of dirt that the bottle brush didn't reach. So we can just swirl this around and give it a bit of a shake, and you can hear the copper. You should be able to hear that through the microphone. It's actually swishing around, and already the bottom looks pretty clean. We've got a lot of reflection there, but you can see we've pretty well got rid of all our dirt on the inside. A little bit still left there, but not too bad. So a bit of a shake, and the weight of the copper will clean it up pretty easily. It's not going to get staining off, but it will certainly get any residual dirt from out of the inside. That's come up pretty good. Now the copper is even more beneficial with things like these little ink bottles that are very hard to get bottle brushes into the corners. This one has quite dirty inside on the base, so we'll put a bit of copper in this and give it a shake. So let's salvage our copper out of this bottle, and what I'm going to do is just tip it through a sieve. And I think we've got it all out. Okay, it's a bit hard to see here because of all our soap suds, but there's all our copper salvaged. And if our funnel fits, yes it does, we can now put the copper into the ink bottle. And there we have it, the copper's in there, no problems. We want about 1/3 to 1/4 of water. If you have too much water, you don't get enough of the copper swishing around. It seems to have more momentum. I think that's probably about right. That's almost half actually. And you can feel that it really swishes around well, and it just feels like it's cleaning. And you can get into all the little corners of these inks with the copper. And again, with a little bit of suds, you can actually see then what's clean and what isn't. And I reckon we've got that pretty clean. A little bit dirty over this corner, you can see. But the other side's not too bad. So you can weight it to whichever corner needs it more. Alright, how are we looking now? Okay, there's still a little bit of staining on the inside. That may be the residual of some ink or something. It's certainly not loose soil. In fact, that might even be on the outside. Let me keep it blocked there so we don't lose our copper. And we'll try. Ah, there you go. It was on the outside. So that's cleaned up pretty well. Let's save our copper again. And there we have quite a clean ink. It's obviously got bubbles in it, but it actually looks fantastic. It cleaned up really well. So that was only just soil in there. It wasn't any staining. And I'll rinse that in clean water, and that's pretty well spotless. Your copper is going to build up contaminants in there after a while, particularly if there's like algae or something in the bottles. So to just clean the copper, still in the sieve, you can float any bits off you don't want, and it should stay pretty clean. Eventually you're going to get little granules of dirt and stuff in there, which will probably help with cleaning anyway. So that should last a long, long time, that little piece of copper. So we'll save our copper in its own special little jar for use another day, and if I need to cut a bit more I can add it to that. I'll just leave that dry in the sun before I put the lid on. So you've washed your bottles and they've come up pretty good. Some have a little bit of haziness that you missed, but generally that one's a nice example of probably a 1930s ink bottle. But others you're disappointed because they looked clean, and then as they dry they have all this sort of filminess on them. Bit of this has got some wavy lines on it, and you thought, well, it should have cleaned off. Well, it actually doesn't, because that's kind of an oxidization of the glass from where it has spent most of its life lying in the soil. Different soils, as I mentioned earlier, will react differently to glass, and some of them, like this broken cod here, you're never going to get them much cleaner than that. It's actually, well, it's referred to as sick in the bottle collecting world. It's badly opalized. Sometimes you even get flakiness. Sometimes you get beautiful rainbow type colors, but it is, and it can form on the inside as well as the outside, and there's no real way of cleaning that off because it's actually in the glass. It's affected the glass. It's not just a coating. The only way to clean bottles up, if you want to get them back to nice and shiny, is to have them mechanically polished, which I did mention earlier. And bottle collectors will refer to having a bottle tumbled, where they spend a few days tumbling around, usually with the copper, cut copper, and then various grades of cutting and then polishing compounds. Sometimes it's a good way to treat a bottle. Other times it can be done poorly, and you can lose some of the embossing. You can lose the historic patina of a bottle because it's actually cleaning the outer layer of the glass off. So by their very nature, old bottles are not supposed to look new. And to my mind, this one is still a nice shelf bottle, even with a little bit of cloudiness. You can give them a bit of a smear with baby oil or a light grade oil, and if the bottle looks great wet and then dries really cloudy, a baby oil will actually make it look a lot better on the shelf. It won't hurt the bottle. The only drawback is that oil makes a bottle slippery, so be careful you don't drop it. And also it will attract a bit more dust. You can oil them on the inside if they're cloudy on the inside, and it's only the lightest film, and it does actually make a bottle that looks a bit sick look a lot better. To my mind, this one looks pretty good like this. Sometimes if it is just a haziness that isn't in the glass, a bit of steel wool, you can even dry, you can see if it's going to take it off. In that case it doesn't. But I have an amber version of the same bottle here, and it's got some cloudiness on the top here, and even though I have washed it, it didn't come off, and yet the steel wool cleans it up quite well there. So that's obviously some sort of coating that will clean off fine, but in most cases, if they look good when they're wet and then they dry like this, you're not going to improve them much at all, unless you have them polished, which in most cases it's not really worth the expense. And of course you do have to be careful of who does it, because it's quite a skill. Now here's another bottle with some bad opalization, and a lot of that's on the inside. Now it could be stains from the contents, but I'd say in this case, because it's that iridescent rainbowy type look, I'd say that's actually the glass. So the only way to clean that out would be to have it polished. And this bottle is quite a common ammonia bottle, certainly not worth getting polished. So I think just put it on the shelf and admire it for what it is. There's plenty of collectors that will argue for polishing, and there's other collectors that will say, no, you should never polish a bottle, it destroys its original character. I think both sides have a point. Some bottles do look a lot better, like this one we had before, with a light polish, whereas this one is never going to look very good on a shelf amongst a lineup of similar cods. But anyway, it's your choice. The trouble, though, you do have to consider with polishing is that it's not reversible. Things like baby oil, certainly reversible. Sometimes people will clear lacquer them, and that's not so bad because it can be removed. But polishing removes a layer of glass, and it's not actually reversible. So just be aware of that. So I've just finished cleaning this one up just with the steel wool, and doesn't that look fantastic? That's a nice glossy bottle. So you don't need to be worried about steel wool on the glass as long as you don't overwork it. It's a great way to clean up some surface dullness if it's caused by a layer of something. But there we go. That'll look fantastic on the shelf. While we're on mechanical cleaning of bottles, I mentioned this one earlier with the remains of some sort of wrap around the top of it. They often had something over the cork, a bit like a champagne bottle does have today. And I find that can usually come off with the scourer. Again, you don't want to work too hard because you may mark the bottle, but that usually cleans them up quite well. You can also use some chemicals, and I haven't really talked about chemicals yet. We'll get to that shortly. Internal staining and remains of some contents are a problem that you do really need chemicals with, particularly if it's an oil or a tar. I don't know what they put in some bottles, but I've had some that have just been almost like sump oil that's turned into tar, and it's almost impossible to get out without a lot of work. But if you've got a rare bottle in good condition, it's worth the effort. What I would do with this, well, we'll give it a wash in soapy water first, but I expect that that's not going to come out, and it's probably going to make our bottle brush look a bit gummy. But let's have a go first. Clean down the outside with our scourer. And the soap should highlight the internal stains, the soapiness, the bubbles. So let's get a bit of water in there. And we'll get our bottle brush in and see what's going to happen. Most of the bottle looks pretty clean, but we can see that big stain in there now, and it doesn't look like it's going to come out with a bottle brush. Yep, so whatever that is not going to dissolve with soapy water. Check the brush. Sometimes the brush comes out all oily and gummy depending what it is. That's fine. It's obviously set very hard. So we can try a bit of wire just to have a poke at it to see if it's going to flake off. Sometimes it will chip away. This feels very hard. I'm just working on the edge of it now. It will come off. We're seeing a few lines from the wire, but it's quite hard. So that's going to need some long-term soaking, not in water, I would suggest. I've had a few people mention that acetone works quite well. So you could fill it with acetone. It tends to dissolve a lot of stuff. A solvent like this is not going to hurt the glass. I tend to just use petrol because it's cheap and I usually have plenty of it. So I would fill that with petrol. I would leave it soak for a few weeks, maybe poke it with a bit of wire and see if it's dissolving. If the petrol has turned black, well, obviously you're getting somewhere and you may have to just rinse and repeat quite a few times. So internal stains can be a problem, but don't be afraid to use solvents. Petrol, as I said, I use and it's quite good and it will dissolve a lot of stuff. Acetone, worth a try. You could try any other solvents you've got in your shed. You're not going to hurt the glass. And our water hasn't even changed colour here, so a few flakes of something, so that is set very hard and it's going to take some time to dissolve. Other bottles, particularly chemists and medicines and poison bottles, can get a contents staining. Sometimes you do find bottles in a tip with some of the original contents still in them, be it a powder or a liquid. Be very careful of that because there was no regulations back in the day as to what these companies could put in their cures and medicines. And some of it, well, you can also find poisons bottles with strychnine and all sorts of nasty concoctions. So be very careful if you're actually out digging bottles because the contents could be quite dangerous. They do often stain the glass, and other than trying solvents, you really don't have much of a choice, except you could possibly put a bit of baby oil in it and see if it hides the staining. Otherwise, it's a matter of getting it physically or mechanically polished, which on a lot of cases on little common poisons bottles like this or chemist bottles, it's not really worth the expense. I don't know what it costs to have a bottle polished these days. Last time I had one done, it was around about $50 Australian, but it was a cod bottle and it was a valuable bottle and it was worth getting done properly. As for one of these, I would just live with it and say it's part of its story. Oh, I just remembered another treatment you can try for internal staining is a strong bleach. It can work very well, and I've heard people, I don't know if you can buy it overseas, but people in Australia often use a product called nappy sand, but it's basically a laundry bleach, so that's certainly worth a try. And again, it comes back to the fact that chemicals aren't going to harm your glass, just be careful using them. Speaking of chemicals and being careful, we're going to move on to something a bit stronger now. The top shelf of chemicals, acids. So the last common stain you're going to find on bottles that you dig up are rust stains. Now, I only have this one here, which isn't a very good example, but it has definitely got rust stains on the bottom there. You can see that, and around that side. So I've cleaned this bottle and I've scrubbed it with steel wool. And also this bottle here has a rust patch up the back, and because the bottle's obviously broken and not in very good condition, I really worked that hard with the steel wool, and it still won't remove the rust. It's almost like it's eaten itself into the glass. So the best way to get rid of rust stains, and sometimes you'll dig a bottle in a tip and it'll have all the one side of it will just be brown with rust and it just won't wash off. That's where the acid is handy. Hydrochloric acid, or spirits of salts, and also known as muriatic acid, is great for removing the rust. It will dissolve the rust stains, and you do have to be very careful with it, but it doesn't need to be super strong. However, for this little example here, we'll try a bit straight out of the bottle, and I know I should have gloves on. I don't have any handy at the moment, so I'm going to be very careful. I'm going to try a little bit here, just on a cotton bud, and see if it will actually take it off in front of our very eyes. So normally I wouldn't do it like this. I would just soak half the bottle in a little bit of diluted acid and leave it soak for a while. This, look at that, certainly coming off. You can see the yellow on the bud there. So this is probably a fairly safe way of doing it because you're not using a lot of chemical. You do have to be in a well ventilated situation because it is fairly volatile and the fumes aren't good for you. But that's dissolving the rust pretty well in front of our eyes. So if you've got a bottle with a lot of rust at one side, let's take a bit off here, it would be worth mixing up a weaker solution of the acid so you're not wasting so much of it, and putting it in a little shallow tray. That's just wiping off now. And leaving it soak for a little bit, and you'll find it cleans the bottles up beautifully. Again, the acid won't hurt the glass. And I think you can also buy it as a brick cleaner through the hardware stores. And that's pretty well all gone. There you go. You can see the cotton bud there is pretty well all where our rust's gone. I'm not going to touch this, of course. Acid can certainly burn. But that's cleaned it off very well. And there's the same spot on that bottle with not a speck of rust left. I've just rinsed it off with some fresh water outside. Looks like the front of it has a bit of a scuff. It could have been a shovel mark. Sometimes you do rub a shovel against them, or it could have happened well before it was even thrown out. But the rust is all gone, so that works really well. If I had a lot of rust on this bottle, I would use a tray like this, prop it up on one side, and just have enough acid solution to soak the area I'm working on, perhaps a tray with a slightly higher side. So we're not using too much chemical, and it just works in an area where you need it. I guess if you've got a bottle that's been totally rusted all around, you could submerge the whole thing, but you're talking lots more chemicals then, and of course with that becomes more risk. Anyway, that's how we get rid of rust. If you have a stoneware bottle like a ginger beer, I wouldn't use this acid on stoneware. I believe it can affect the glaze. So if you have a rusted stoneware piece, or maybe a little round pot lid, a ceramic porcelain type pot lid with rust staining, don't use an acid. Go for something like Ranex Rustbuster, I think it's called. There's a few other chemicals as well, which are basically phosphoric acid. I've never had much success with this type of product. Maybe it does work okay on rust, but calcium and lime, I don't know, unless you've got a bottle that's come out of the ocean and it's got crustaceans on it, maybe that's the calcium, maybe it would work all right there. I've never had much success using this stuff on bottles. But the Ranex Rustbuster, I'm not sure if you can buy it on Amazon or not. If you can, I'll leave a link. With any treatment though on pottery or glazed objects, you do need to make sure they're rinsed properly. And I know some collectors that clean up the little pot lids with phosphoric acid or whatever, they actually leave them soak in water for sometimes weeks. And one of the little tricks they use is to put it in the cistern of a toilet, because it's constantly refreshing with fresh water. And as long as you've only got a fairly small object, it will fit in there fine. And it just rinses away all the chemicals so that the glaze on the pottery isn't affected down the track. So that's about it for cleaning. I hope I've covered everything. It's certainly the processes that I usually do. I know there's people that have their favourite chemicals. There might be gumption, I think, as an abrasive cleaner, which works well in some situations. Overseas, I did see a few people in the States use other products. It's worth experimenting because none of them are really going to harm the glass. The one you need to be most careful on is anything abrasive as far as mechanical cleaning goes. And be conscious too of probably the most critical thing with glass is sudden change in temperature. And someone actually commented of buffing up or polishing a bottle with a Dremel. I saw that on a forum somewhere. The Dremel can create quite a bit of heat, and remember that thick glass isn't a good conductor of heat, and you'll have stresses in the glass, so you can cause cracks. I think that's about it. If you find bottles like this cod, you're not going to get it any cleaner than that. And you'll notice all the high points on the embossing have a bad rash on them. That's when the bottles sat in the crate and they're rattled against each other. Sometimes you'll see milk bottles with a line around the top. Actually, this one here, we took the rust off before, has a bit of a line around the top, and that's known as crate rash, where they just rattle against each other in the crate. You can't do anything with that. It's physical damage to the glass. Same with most of the marks on this. So don't expect your antique bottles to look mint condition unless you go to the trouble of having them completely polished, in which case you're removing the original finish. And as I said, some collectors will probably consider that devaluing the bottle. I think it depends how it's done. So enjoy your bottle collecting. The cleaning can be a bit of a chore, but at least doing it carefully and using the right products, you're less likely to cause any damage, because one thing's for sure, it's hard work digging a good bottle. You've got to be lucky to find a good one. It would be such a shame to destroy it in the cleaning process. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you had some information, or you got some good information out of this. Feel free to put anything in the comments that perhaps I've missed, or just other ideas that I'm not aware of. Heaps of people have their own little ways, so feel free to share underneath. For the rest of you, read the comments. You might learn even more. Thanks for watching, guys. Catch you in the next video. Bye for now.